I always say welcome, and then I'm like, half of you live here, and I don't, and it's slightly weird. But welcome to my talk, you know. So as you probably noticed, in the 10 minutes before we kicked off here, we just replaced 3 different cables, tried 3 different laptops, and we're currently running the stunt laptop with an HDMI cable that only just got woken up. It's going to be fine. We are all professionals. Absolutely nothing is going to go weird, except maybe the fonts. So let's talk about software. Let's talk about code. Let's talk about the cycle that I'm sure is familiar to all of the people in this room, which is what I call the stages of shiny. And it starts like this. You suddenly become aware that something exists in the world that you didn't know about. 10 minutes ago, you had no idea. And now suddenly you've seen it, and you're like, I need that. It's a new phone, it's a new laptop, it's a software plugin or an IDE or a tool chain or something that just, you've seen that it exists and now you must have it, otherwise you will never be happy. And so you order it, or you download it, or you buy it, and you get it, and you're all excited, and you're unboxing it, and you're plugging it in and setting it up and configuring it. And then this happens. You're like, hang on. I got this new shiny smartwatch because it said on the website that it would play MP3s even when I didn't have my phone. And I'm trying to put my MP3s on it, and the only button I can see here is the one to link my Deezer subscription, whatever that is. Or the thing when your company's got a new CRM sales pipeline tool, and the salesperson said, oh yeah, plug-in straight out of GitHub. Yes, it can totally do that. And so you get it set up, and you're like, right, let's deploy some plugins, and you're like, I don't see GitHub here anywhere. There's this little box where I can paste JavaScript into the web page. This is not what we signed up for. And you realize that the thing, the device, the platform, the tool, the code, whatever it is, technically, it is capable of doing everything that you need. You just need to tweak it a little bit. You need to configure it. You need to get it set up the way that you wanted. Now, one of the hallmarks, I think, of a true hacker is the first thing they will do when they get something new is they will start messing with it. My girlfriend cannot believe that I will bring a brand new guitar home from the store, and the first thing I will do with it is start taking apart and replacing it. She's like, what are you doing? What's wrong with it? I'm like, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just not right. And all you folks out there, like you have your IDE set up just the way you want it, and you've got your colors and your fonts and your code and your contrast and all that kind of stuff, you know. This is what I'm talking about, is you want to be able to tweak it. If there's something there which isn't quite right, that is going to drive you mad until you figure out how to make it work. And for that kind of person, that kind of hacker, the worst thing you can possibly do is you can say no. You say, oh yeah, no, the product can do that, but sorry, that feature's only in the premium edition, which you haven't paid for. Oh yeah, you could do that, but we're not going to let you because we don't like you. Yeah, it would be easy, but now it's our source code. You can't have it. You're not allowed to make changes with it. Now, about 40 years ago, Xerox donated a printer to the Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It was about 1980, and generalized AI was 2 years away. AI was working on it, and they're like, yeah, 2 years, then we'll have artificial intelligence. Because they'd only just got laser printers, and clearly AI was like the next logical step along that journey. Now, Xerox and MIT, they're both, you know, titans in the history of information technology. Xerox invented mice. Xerox invented Windows. Xerox invented laser printing. Xerox invented Ethernet. And Xerox completely failed to capitalize on any of these because they were terrified of anything that might jeopardize their photocopying business, and that's why today Xerox is still a photocopier company. And MIT invented the software that took human beings to the moon, and they invented Lisp, and they invented passwords, and TCP/IP, and Roombas, and Lisp, and blockchain, and free software, maybe. Because one of the people who was working there at the time, there was a problem with this laser printer, you see. The problem with the laser printer was basically a photocopier with a network card. And photocopiers, do we still have people using photocopiers? You know what a photocopier is, right? Yeah? You know that they are prone to doing this. They get jammed. And the thing about a photocopier is when it jams, you're standing in front of it because you're making your copies. And so copy, 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 and you pull the door open, you kind of kick it a bit. And it's like getting the dog to let go of something it's not supposed to have. You kind of, eventually you get the paper out, you close the door, and you smack it a bit, and off it goes. But a network printer, you send your print job, and then, you know, you sit and get on with your work, and then later you got to get a cup of coffee. You're like, I should pick up my printout, and it's jammed. And it didn't jam on your job, it jammed 3 hours ago. And so the printer has been set there. You're number 17 in a queue that hasn't moved since this morning. And so you kind of swear, you unjam it a little bit and get it going, and it grinds, and then it eventually jams again. And one of the people working at MIT at the time the story takes place is this guy, Richard Stallman. Now, I'm sure some of you have opinions about Stallman, and I'm sure those opinions are not the same as some of your other opinions about Stallman. We cannot tell the story of free software without talking about Richard Stallman and the laser printer, because he had a good idea. He's like, we got a network printer, we got a bunch of people on the network. Why don't we just modify the printer so that if it gets jammed, it just sends a network broadcast message saying, help, I'm stuck, somebody come and unjam me, and then whoever's closest can go and do it. So he went to Xerox, and he's like, I need the control software for the printer you gave us. And Xerox said, no. You can't have that software. We're not giving it to you. You can't have the source code. Somebody had explicitly been told, do not give Stallman the source code for the printer. Now, there are two versions of this story. There's the version which says that this incident galvanized his commitment. It was the day that Stallman realized that unless the world was built on free and open software, people would never truly be free and open. And there's another version which says that he was so butthurt about it that he's still pissed 40 years later. I think both versions are kind of true, you know. But Stallman has spoken many, many times about this incident with the laser printer and this realization that if you can't control the software, then really you have no control over the device and the tools that you can use to do your work. But to put this in context, you know, what do we mean by free? What are we talking about? Because historically, there's a bunch of different things that are free in the English language. The English word free, historically we've talked about free as in free beer. Now, anyone want a beer? Yeah, beer's great, right? I'll give you a free beer. Now, if I give you a free beer, it means, yes, now you have a delicious, refreshing Sagres or Superbock that you did not have to pay for. What can you do with it? Well, you can drink it, except, well, maybe you can't drink it because you're on medication, or maybe you can't drink it for religious reasons. Maybe you can't drink it because you're driving, or because you're 12 years old. So there's a lot of people who can't drink the beer. So what else can you do with beer? Can you keep it? Anyone want a mug of beer from yesterday? Can you sell it? No, you can't sell it. The government is like, you don't go around selling beer, not without a license. So free beer is actually a pretty good example because you got this nice drink that didn't cost you any money, but you can't do anything with it. You can drink it or you can throw it down the drain. That's it. Those are your choices. You have no control over the future of that. Now, the world we live in today is absolutely full of software that is free as in beer. Anyone pay for Instagram? Why would you pay for that? But you do, you just don't pay in money. You pay in attention, you pay in data. You give them things that are valuable to them. Facebook, Google Maps, Gmail, all of these applications, we don't pay money to use them. And so they are free as in beer. Don't pay any money for it, but you get no control. You get no portability, no say in how any of this stuff happens. Now, I'm going to ask you a slightly weird question. Does anyone in here own second-hand software? I mean, some people have got like a Windows 95 they bought on eBay, but the idea of second-hand software, you know, software is incredibly valuable. Software is expensive. People spend lots of money on software. People spend money on software they're not using anymore. Surely we should be able to sell it. No. That's not how any of this works anymore. Second-hand software now is a curiosity. It's digging up old versions of Windows on eBay, because when you pay money for software, you don't own anything. And even if you don't own it, you can't sell it. Valve, earlier this year, they went out and said, yeah, we've had a look at the Steam terms and conditions, and you cannot leave your games collection to your kids when you die. When you die, all your games they're just gone away. They're ours now. We get them all back. You can't have them anymore. But it wasn't always like this. When I was a kid, games came on cartridges. And the thing about games on cartridges is that the software and the distribution medium, there's no downloading, there's no disks, there's no copying. The game was a piece of plastic. The fact it was full of code was didn't really matter. That was Sonic Hedgehog. And if you had it, you could play Sonic, and if you didn't have it, you couldn't. And so you could sell it. You could lend it to your friends. You could go to the video store, and you could rent Sonic Hedgehog on Friday and play all weekend and try and finish it before your mum would take it back on Monday morning. And there were two kinds of kids at my school. I was a teenager in Bristol in the UK, and there were the console kids. And the console kids had shaved heads and skateboards, and they were always in trouble for setting stuff on fire. And the computer kids had long hair and mountain bikes, and we also set stuff on fire, but we were smart enough not to get caught. And they had the games consoles, and we had the PCs, and the Ataris and the Amigas. And if we wanted to play games, if I wanted to play a new game on my PC, I had a choice. I could go out and buy it. Now, X-Wing and Eye of the Beholder, Monkey Island, these all retailed for about £25. Now, to put it in perspective, £25, that's the same as 25 Big Macs, or like a new pair of jeans. It's a significant investment for a teenager with no money. Or I could pirate them. Now, the games came up with increasingly ingenious ways of trying to prevent people from copying them. There is no copy protection mechanism in the world that will beat a bored teenager with no money. One of them even came with a cardboard disc that said, "Dial a pirate." Like, "Hey, Steve, hello, can I copy Monkey Island?" It's right there on the copy protection. We figured out ways to replicate the cardboard decoder rings. We figured out ways to copy the hidden sectors and hack the binaries. And we knew it was illegal. And if you made like 100 copies of X-Wing and tried to sell them at a computer fair, maybe the police would get involved. But kids copying games and swapping them in the schoolyard was never going to get on the FBI's radar. So we could buy them or we could copy them. But there was a third option. Because in the back of the computer magazines, there were classified adverts for companies that sold free software. And we all knew that you weren't buying the code, you were buying the disk. The software, now some of this was public domain. The people who wrote it, not only were they like, "I don't want any money," they're like, "I don't even want you talking to me." They take their contact details off. Just this code, it lives in the world now. Do anything you want with it. And some of it would be demos, and some of it would be restricted, cut-down versions. And there was a lovely thing called postcardware, which was people going, "Look, I made a word processor in my spare time, and I don't want any money, but if you use it, send me a postcard." And they'd get thousands of postcards going, "Thank you for PC Write, it's so good, I love it." But there was also a model that worked through these distribution channels, which became incredibly successful. It was pioneered by this guy. Now, this is Scott Miller. He founded a studio called Apogee Software, and he wrote games for the IBM PC, and he wrote a game called Kingdom of Kroz. And Kingdom of Kroz was so big it wouldn't fit on one floppy disk. It took 3. And so he had this idea. It's like, well, I'm going to split the game into 3 parts. And part 1, I'll just say, this is free. Copy it, share it, give it to your mates. If you want to sell it in your shareware magazines, you can do that. And then when you completed part 1, a little screen popped up saying, "Well done. If you want to play parts 2 and 3, please send a check for $15 or something." And it was his parents' address in Texas. And when he got a check, he'd put 2 and 3 in an envelope and send it to you. Kingdom of Kroz made $100,000 in about 3 weeks. It was hugely successful, and he used that to basically set up a shareware game publishing studio. Now, a couple of years later, he gets hold of a copy of Dangerous Dave by a guy called John Romero, who's working at a game studio called Softdisk. And John Romero, this was like, color scrolling graphics on the IBM PC. John Romero and his buddies, John Carmack and Tom Hoare here, they had like a side group. It was called Ideas from the Deep, and then it was called ID, and then it was just called ID. And they would go on to produce some of the most revolutionary games in the history of gaming. Now, there's a sort of couple of different versions of this story. The bit we know for sure happened is that the two Johns got together over a long weekend sometime in the late 80s, early 90s, and they ported Super Mario to the IBM PC just to see if they could. And they sent a copy of it to Nintendo and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And Nintendo went, "This is brilliant. Bury it. Bury it real deep." Nintendo did not want kids copying Super Mario in the playground. They wanted kids spending money on the Super Mario game cartridges. Scott Miller gets word of this. He pings the two Johns and he goes, "Hey, your technology is fantastic. The side-scrolling and the jumping, why don't you just come up with some different characters and a different premise for it, and you can publish your game on my platform." And so they came out with Commander Keen, Invasion of the Vorticons, where you're an 8-year-old kid whose babysitter has been kidnapped by aliens, and so you build a space rocket and you get your pogo stick and your football helmet and you go up into space. This was so successful that all of the Johns quit their jobs and they're like, "That's it, we're going to do shareware gaming now. The future is we'll give away part 1, and if you want part 2 and 3, you have to send us a check." They would go on to develop Wolfenstein 3D, which was the first kind of real, it wasn't full 3D, but it was the first game where you could run around corners and shoot people and that kind of stuff. And then they developed Doom, and they crashed every college network in America because it had IPX multiplayer. And then Quake, which was not the first truly 3D game, but it was one of the pioneering ones, one of the earliest games to use 3D graphics accelerators. My friends and I used to play Quake. I think the record was 31 hours of deathmatch without a break. These were excellent games. But they also, Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake, they represented a series of paradigm shifts in the way software was distributed. I got Wolfenstein on the cover of PC Format magazine. I copied Doom off a friend of mine at school, and I downloaded Quake from the idsoftware.com website, which not only did it have the download, if you wanted, you could download it in 7 different files to put on floppy disks to give to your friends who didn't have the internet at home, because that was still a thing. This was sort of 1996, 97. Now, this is the point where people are getting modems, people are getting online. The World Wide Web is just kind of waking up and figuring out what it wants to be when it grows up, and thinking probably not what we've got today, but that's a talk for another day. But as we got online, we got connected, we started hanging out on Usenet and bulletin boards and those kinds of things, we discovered that there was a bunch of people who'd been online a lot longer than we had. And they had ideas about software being free that had nothing to do with coming on the cover of PC Format magazine. To them, free was about the 4 essential freedoms. It was about the freedom to run the program however you want for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and modify it to do what you want, the freedom to distribute copies, and the freedom to share your own modifications. And these were the founding principles behind the GNU project. GNU stands for GNU's not Unix, because it's not Unix, except it is, but it's not, and recursive acronyms are apparently really funny. They started working in 1983 on a completely free as in free speech, free as in unrestricted clone of the Unix operating system. By the early 1990s, they were almost there, which is a bit like saying you've almost finished inventing a car, because you've got cup holders and wing mirrors and a steering wheel. Engine having a bit of trouble with. And along the way, they came out with this, the GNU General Public License, which was the first attempt at a legally binding document that enshrined those principles of free software, the way they interpreted it, in something that might stand up in court. Then, a couple of years later, University of Helsinki, somebody no one's ever heard of called Linus Torvalds is doing a little hobby in his spare time. And hello, everybody out there using Minix. You remember Minix? I'm doing a free operating system. It's just a hobby. It won't be big and professional like GNU. For 386 and 486 AT clones, and there was a lovely note a bit further down saying it'll only ever support this hard drive because it's the only one I can afford. And he put his Linux kernel on a public FTP server and said, come and play with this. And within a couple of months, the kernel was published under the GPL, and when you combine that with all of the tools that GNU had already established, we had a completely free operating system for PC-compatible 8.6 architecture machines. Now, this is probably a good time to ask why. And probably also a good time to say, where's open source? Because at this point, no one has ever used the phrase open source yet. That expression has not come up. Now, I think Linus Torvalds probably shared his Linux kernel just because he was proud of what he'd done and he wanted to show people. And lots of folks, I do that with code. I'm sure lots of you do that with code. And you're kind of thinking open source, but really you're just thinking, look at me, look what I did. And I think that the folks at id Software, John Carmack, John Romero, I think they used free software as a publishing model that meant they could afford to write more games. I met John Romero at an event in Berlin last year and had a very brief chat with him. And this guy's so rich, he bought a Ferrari on the proceeds of his computer games, and then he gave it away in a competition. He's not doing it for the money. He still writes code every day. They love coding, they love games, and they were writing the games they wanted to play, and shareware was the easiest way to cover the cost of doing that. But I think for the folks at GNU, free software was the executable expression of their ideology. They were making free software because they thought that was how they were going to make the world a better place. Now, at this sort of point in history, we're at 1996, 1997, and the web is interesting because companies are aware of it, but they don't know what to do with it yet. And so lots of folks, myself included, we get jobs as webmasters. And the webmasters didn't get to work with corporate IT. We weren't anywhere. They're like, we'll put you in a corner and we'll give you a server. Don't make a mess, and please, can we have a website thing? One of those things that we've read about in the magazines. Now, if anyone ever tried running a website on Microsoft Windows in the late 90s, there was a niche here. We needed server-grade operating systems that would appeal to people who had very little budget to invest and relatively little expertise. None of us had a huge amount of time working with this stuff. And companies like Red Hat, they saw an opportunity. They're like, well, we could take all this GNU software that's out there, and we could put it all together, we can compile it, we can make sure it works, we can put it on a CD-ROM, and we can put it in a box, and we can sell it. And companies loved this, because companies were like, we don't want man pages. What we want is software in a box that we can buy in a store, we can take it home, and if it doesn't work, we can call the phone number on the back, and somebody will help us set it up. Which led to this slightly weird thing of Red Hat selling free software for $80. And companies going, yeah, brilliant. All right, well, hang on. It says free. What's the $80 for? And the first person to use the term open source, the person we have to credit that with, is this lady, Christine Peterson. She's a founder of a research thing called the Foresight Institute, and she was involved in a lot of the discussion around how do we sell free software? How do we create revenue streams around software that you are free to modify, free to copy, free to get the source code, all these kinds of things? And as she said in a memoir of what happened at the time, those new to the term free software assume it's referring to the price, and old-timers must then launch into an explanation, which is usually given, we mean free as in freedom, not free as in beer. And at this point, a discussion on software has turned into one about the price of an alcoholic beverage. Between meetings that week, I was focused on the need for a better name. I came up with the term open source software. And actually go and read her account of this, because it's really interesting. She didn't ever suggest it. She just started using it in meetings to see if, like, the tech bros would start using it as well. And when they did, she's like, yeah, this is probably going to work. And it took off. And within 2 weeks, Bruce Perens and Eric Raymond had set up the opensource.org, the kind of first real public, this is what open source is, and this is what we're doing about it. Tim O'Reilly was running the Free Software Summit. He renamed that to the Open Source Summit in fairly short order. And this idea was starting to get a lot of traction. A lot of companies were interested in this idea of, hey, we can publish the code, but we can still sell this thing as a product. Now, one of the complexities here was a clause in the GPL, the GNU General Public License, that said you may not impose any further restrictions on the recipient's exercise of the rights granted herein. Now, this basically says that if I take some GPL code that you have published under the GPL, you can't restrict my ability to do anything with that, but I also can't take that and close it down. I can't make that closed source. And the mechanism that operates this is really interesting because it runs using copyright. If you've written a line of code that is in the Linux kernel, legally, you are the author of the Linux kernel, along with a whole bunch of other people, but you have not signed over those rights to anybody. You can still assert your right to do that. Now, this gets really interesting around 2002. This device, the Linksys WRT514G, comes out. And this is it cost about $100. It's got 4 network ports. It's got a couple of Wi-Fi chips in it. It's basically a tiny network computer. They sold 250,000 of these things in 3 months. Really, really successful product. And one day, a guy called Andrew Viklas, he went on to found the PagerDuty company, if anyone knows them. He's poking around the Linux kernel mailing lists, and he sees a note about this, and he downloads the firmware update from their website and unzips it, and he's like, this is interesting. There's a Linux kernel in here and a whole bunch of other stuff. Now, the reason why this was such a big deal, this was the days when Wi-Fi didn't work on Linux. Wi-Fi was still a pretty neat idea, and it was notoriously difficult to get a stable Wi-Fi connection using the open source drivers, because most Wi-Fi companies didn't care about Linux, they didn't publish drivers for it. This thing had Broadcom network chips, and the firmware that was in there clearly had support for a whole range of them, and the community wanted the code. They wanted that source code so they could replicate it and they could put it into Linux, they could get better networking support. So he gets in touch with the Free Software Foundation. Now, at this point, the timeline gets a little bit weird, because July 2003, Linksys released the GPL code. They are required under the GNU public license. They used Linux to build a thing. They have to share their source code with anyone who buys that device by making it available for download. So yeah, okay, 2003, they publish it. That's great. They've caved to community pressure. 5 years later, the Free Software Foundation sues them. Now, at this point, Linksys is owned by Cisco. Cisco accidentally bought a lawsuit. They acquired Linksys, and then someone said, boss, you should probably look at this thing that we found. And I don't know quite what happened in the intervening 5 years. Now, my hunch on this is the Free Software Foundation thought this could be like a poster child lawsuit. They thought if they could push this all the way to the US court with Cisco on the other side of it, and they could get a verdict affirming the legality of the GPL, that would then be a legal precedent which would solve a lot of the kind of what's actually going to happen if this ever gets to court. It didn't. Cisco settled. Cisco eventually turned around and went, yeah, you know what, you're right. We're going to hire a compliance director. We're going to make a massive donation to make you go away, and we're going to release the source code for all the firmware updates for this device. Now, as far as I'm aware, the only time the GPLs ever made it to court was in Germany. There's a guy called Harold Velter who started a website called gplviolations.org, which I think is just him finding companies who violated the GPL and suing them to see what happens. And he took D-Link to court successfully. This went all the way to the Frankfurt District Court, and they affirmed that, yes, D-Link is using Linux. Yes, they haven't published the source code. That means that they are in violation of the license agreement. And yes, by the way, the GPL is a legally binding document under German intellectual property law. I don't know what happened after that. I mean, it's not like D-Link went out of business or anything, but there is this precedent. This thing is now sort of part of the legal history. Now, around this time, in 2001, Steve Ballmer, who was then the CEO of Microsoft, he said this. He said, Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That's the way the license works. No, it's not the way the license works. It's not the way Linux works. And cancer is not contagious, Steve. That's not how any of this works. But good quote, good soundbite. CEO of Microsoft gets picked up in the press all over the world. Microsoft, in the late 90s, was terrified of open source, because Microsoft made all their money selling Windows and Exchange and Outlook and SQL Server and all of these expensive desktop operating systems and Office and all these kinds of things. Microsoft has done a dramatic about-face in the intervening 25 years. Today, Microsoft loves open source. I mean, some bits, we're never going to see open source Excel anytime soon, but Microsoft Developer Division, they love open source. Everything out there, you want the source code? Yeah, absolutely, here you go. You can have it, you can modify it. And the reason for that is the cloud. And the cloud changed everything in terms of the economies of scale of how to make money out of software. Because what it meant is, instead of having to sell the software, and then it doesn't matter if the customer runs it all day, every day, or they put it in a cupboard and it never gets installed, you're not getting any more money. Cloud says, well, here's the software for free. Oh, you want to run it? All right, let's have a little conversation here. Now, around the time I was working as a webmaster, one of the things I did was I built servers. And, clients would say, hey, can you set me up a server? And we'd charge them for the hardware. And then I would put Linux and Apache and MySQL and all these kinds of things on it and charge them, $1,000, £1,000 a day to do that. And if I got 50 phone calls one morning saying, hey, can all these people, 50 different customers, hey, can we have a web server with a database by this afternoon? In theory, I've just made £50,000 in a day. In practice, no, I've just turned down 50 grand in revenue because I can't do that. I can't build them that fast. And the cloud just said, well, you know what? That doesn't scale. Servers don't scale. You know what scales? Shipping containers full of servers which are completely automated, and we'll just script every single step of this thing. If 50 people ring us up in the morning, hey, can we have a web server? We're like, yes, please put your credit card number in here and click the button, and boom, they got a web server. They got a database. All free software. Free operating systems, free databases, free networking tools, free everything, until the point where there are companies out there making a serious amount of money out of running free software that people are paying them to run. Let's meet Sammy the squirrel. Sammy lives in the forest with all the other woodland creatures, and they frolic about, and they splash in the stream, and they hunt for acorns, and every Sunday, they all go down to the glade with the big tree stump, and they show each other what they've been working on. Woodland show and tell. And Sammy likes to make games. And Sammy's made a game called Acorn Adventure, which is brilliant because you get to run around the forest like you're a little squirrel. And some of the animals are like, isn't this a bit close to real life, Sammy? But the rest of them are like, this is great. And everyone's really excited about it. And show and tell the next week, Jeff turns up. Jeff the raccoon. Jeff's got an arcade cabinet, and the arcade cabinet is running Acorn Adventure, and Sammy thinks this is brilliant. That's my game. Look, it's running with joysticks and everything. And there's a little coin slot where the animals can put in 20 cents to play Acorn Adventure. And the smaller animals, they love this, and they're queuing up to have another go, and they're pestering their dads for more money so they can have another go on Acorn Adventure. And Sammy's like, they love my game. This is so good. And next week, Jeff turns up in a brand new pickup truck with 2 Acorn Adventure arcade cabinets. And by this point, some of the animals are getting a little bit stuck. Like, they got to the end of level 3 where there's an owl you have to defeat, and they're really struggling to get past the owl. And they say, could you change the difficulty? And also, some of the graphics could be a little bit better, and please, could you fix all of this stuff up? And Sammy's like, well, Acorn Adventure is a free game. It's open source. You're free to go in and modify it anytime you want. But of course, to the animals, it's not free. They're paying 20 cents every time they play it. They're paying customers. They're entitled to get their changes. They're entitled to be heard. Next week, Jeff turns up in a solid gold helicopter. But it doesn't matter, because Sammy's been hard at work. Sammy has completed Acorn Adventure 2. And Acorn Adventure 2 fixes all of the problems. It's got better graphics, better music, better gameplay. The owl is easier to defeat. It's got 5 new kinds of acorns, and a little clause in the licensing that says that it's free to download, and you can play it at home, and you can study it, and you can take it apart. But if you want to put it on your arcade machine, then you need to buy a license for $1. Oh, the woodland folk did not like that. There was a riot. Some of them said Sammy was a traitor, Sammy was betraying the cause of open source software, Sammy didn't believe in freedom, Sammy was doing a capitalist rug pull. Some of them took the last version of Acorn Adventure and they forked it, and they called it Open D's Nuts. Now, maybe that's not what happened. Maybe around the time that all of the animals are getting angry that the gameplay's too hard and the owl's too difficult to defeat, Wilbur shows up. Wilbur the Weasel. Wilbur's like, hey, having some trouble with your game there, friend. Why don't you let me help out? And Wilbur starts contributing a little pull request here, a patch there, a couple of graphic sprites over here. Wilbur is prolific. Wilbur is churning out new levels and new interactions and new music and all that kind of stuff. And one of the most requested features is, could we play Acorn Adventure using a credit card so we don't have to keep bringing 20-cent coins into the forest, because that doesn't work with this narrative. And Wilbur goes, yeah, I'll do it. I'll link it to your PayPal accounts and everything. And a couple of weeks later, someone notices that every time you swipe your MasterCard to play Acorn Adventure, it's sending your credit card number to a server in Belarus, which is probably not a good idea. Except by this point, Wilbur's disappeared. And now you think of it, no one remembers seeing Wilbur around before. And all the angry animals that were putting all this pressure on poor Sammy to improve the game, they've vanished too. No one can remember where they came from. We live in a world where trillion-dollar corporations sell free software for money, and the people who make the software. Now, this is not how it happens all the time. This is not how it consistently unfolds. There is a, very early on in the process, the early 2000s, a bunch of folks working with the GPL and the Free Software Foundation, they went, hang on a second, there could be a problem here, because the GPL says that you have to share your source code for any derivative works if you distribute your software. But interacting with it across a network does not constitute distribution. Now, this made sense in the early days when the web didn't really exist yet, but today we have apps, we have app stores, we have online gaming, we have all kinds of things where you never actually download the code, so they're not distributing anything. All you're doing is you're running stuff on their server and interacting with the output. And so a company called Affero, they sat down, the Affero GPL was formed, and this is basically the GPL right up to the point where it says, look, if you interact with that code over the network, that constitutes distribution. If you take a GPL code and use it to run a website, you have to give the complete source code to your entire website to everybody who browses it. They legally have the right to do that. Now, a lot of people don't use AGPL because this sounds prohibitive and perhaps a little bit scary. But we're working in an age when a lot of people do go onto Copilot or Grok or ChatGPT or saying, hey, I am stuck, please help me, because these language models have been trained on vast corpuses of code, some of which I would absolutely guarantee has been published under the Affero GPL. So let's say that some junior engineer or senior engineer working at TikTok or Warcraft, or any of these platforms, Netflix, they get stuck one day, they go onto Copilot, they get some code that just happens to be line for line identical to code which was published under the AGPL, and they deploy that to production. They're then legally required, TikTok has to publish their entire source code, or they're violating the GPL. Now, this is never going to happen because nobody can afford to go to war with TikTok over something as like the AGPL when the lawsuit is going to come down to whether a judge considers that to be a derivative work or not. Because you could argue that language models are going to emit code that is identical to code in somebody else's project, because there's really only so many ways of putting ASCII together and having it compile, and sooner or later you're accidentally going to replicate something. Other people say, no, it's a clear copyright infringement ripoff. You trained it on that library. It produced code from that library. That is copyright violation. You are liable under that. Like I said, we might get a lawsuit about this, we might not, I'm not going to hold my breath, but this is the reason why most corporations that do open source don't use the GPL or any variation of it. They use the Apache, the BSD, the MIT license. Because what these licenses do is they basically, now I'm not a lawyer, I'm certainly not your lawyer, but I have spent a lot of time working with software, working with code, talking to people who do these kinds of things. The MIT license, this is the whole thing. And this basically says, we own this software. We built it, we own it, it's ours. You can do anything you like, except you can't remove the license, and you can't sue us if the software doesn't work. And the most important line here is the top one. We own this software. If any of you folks in here has ever contributed any code at all to .NET, you will have signed a contributor license agreement that says, I don't own this code, you own this. I know it's free, but I transfer ownership of my copyright to the .NET Foundation. If you have contributed to anything administered by Meta, React, or any of those libraries, you will have signed the contributor license agreement that assigns ownership of that onto Meta. And this kind of brings up the question of why people contribute to these libraries. At least with the GPL, it's like I wrote some Linux kernel and I own that and it's mine forever. With this one, it's like I spent my entire weekend adding a feature to Entity Framework and then I gave it to Microsoft, who, let's face it, are not strapped for cash by any stretch of the imagination. Now, some people write open source because they get paid to do it. An awful lot of the code in the .NET runtime and the .NET tooling is open source code that it is somebody's job to do that and write it and maintain it. And that's cool. An awful lot of the code in libraries like React, people who work at Meta get paid to do that. A lot of the stuff in database libraries, there's teams at AWS working on this. All of the big cloud providers, they have people whose job is to do open source and put it back out in the community. Yeah, fine, I understand how that one works. Some people do it because have fun, the end. They're not thinking about the profit outcome. It's just a fun way of, scratching their own itch, working on libraries they want, and then just share it with the world. And this model works sometimes for certain people in certain positions. Normally, people who aren't worried about money. People who are like, they're comfortable and, you know what, this is a fun hobby, and I can afford to share this with the rest of the world. But then there's a whole bunch of people out there who are like, well, I wrote this code, and I put it out there, and now companies are running it, and some of those companies are making quite a lot of money. And I'd like quite a lot of money because I don't have any money at all. And these are the Sammy Squirrel developers. Now, I could not get up here today and talk about open source licensing and the relationship between free software and revenue and stuff without talking about WordPress. Now, I just want to share with you, so WordPress is 5 different things. WordPress is an open source GPL publishing platform. It's written in PHP. It runs on Subversion, and if you have changes to it, please send them a patch. They don't really do pull requests. So anyone who thinks you have to do the latest, shiniest things to be successful, WordPress runs 40% of the web on PHP and Subversion and patches. So clearly there's some correlation here some of us have misunderstood. So that's WordPress, the software. WordPress, the software, is distributed through WordPress.org, which is an open source community nonprofit website that happens to be operated by the same people who own WordPress.com, which is a place where you can give them money to run your WordPress website for you. WordPress is also a trademark. The trademark is owned by the WordPress Foundation, which is an incorporated nonprofit, which just happens to be owned and run by the same people who run WordPress.org and WordPress.com. Everyone clear on that? Let me give you a little timeline. This is September the 16th, a month ago today. I finished my slides for this talk. It's like, yes, fine. I'm not going to worry about it. No last-minute drama is going to derail this. Friday the 20th, Matt Mullenweg, the founder of WordPress and the CEO of Automatic, the company that run all of that, he gives a talk at one of the WordPress events, WordCamp, where he talks about how venture capitalists are asset-stripping the ecosystem and are the enemies of open source. We find out later that that was the same day that his company contacted a company called WP Engine, who provide paid WordPress hosting, demanding 8% of their revenues for their use of the WordPress trademark. WP Engine turns over about $500 million a year, so 8% of their revenues, that's $40 million a year just to put the word WordPress on their website. Are they entitled to do this? Are they not? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I'm just trying to write a talk about open source. 21st, day later, he follows up his WordCamp talk with a blog post about how WP Engine is not WordPress, and his own mother got confused and thought WP Engine was an official thing. and includes this clause. What WP Engine gives you is not WordPress. It's something they've chopped up, hacked, and butchered to look like it, but actually they're giving you a cheap knockoff. Now, WordPress is free. How do you make a cheap knockoff of something that was free? I don't know. And charging you more for it? Well, not cheap if it's more expensive. This is one of the many reasons they are a cancer to WordPress. I have no idea where he is going with this. This gets us up to round about here. 23rd, the lawyers get involved. WP Engine sends a cease and desist to Automatic, claiming false accusations and defamation. Automatic gets their lawyers to send a cease and desist back in the other direction, saying you're not allowed to use the WordPress trademark for anything anymore. We are going to shake you down, all kinds of things. 2 days after that, WordPress.org. Now remember, WordPress.org, this isn't the nasty capitalist WordPress.com where they make the money. This is the fluffy, comfortable sofa and come in and have a hug of open source software and free publishing. They add this box to their login page that you have to affirm you are not affiliated with WP Engine in any way, financially or otherwise, before you can log in. Now this is where all the plugins are managed. This is where you get your security updates. This is where you pull in all of the latest features and bug fixes and patches that are part of the WordPress ecosystem. Matt Mullenweg explains this in a blog post in which he says WP Engine is free to offer their hacked up, bastardized simulacra of WordPress's GPL code to their customers, and they can experience WordPress as WP Engine envisions it, with them getting all of the profits and providing all of the services. He is absolutely 100% correct. Do you know why? Because Matt Mullenweg published WordPress under the GNU public license, which encodes the essential freedoms, including the freedom to run the program however you want for any purpose. So I'm not quite sure what angle they're trying to play up here. That gets us to here. On the 3rd of October, which is just over 2 weeks ago, Automatic says to their employees, look, we know some of you don't like what we're doing. If you don't like it, we'll give you 6 months' salary to walk. Just leave. Just go away. We don't want to deal with you rocking the boat here. And about 8% of their workforce, 159 people go, yeah, that sounds good, all right. 6 months worth of money, they walk out the door. Now, interestingly, one person who didn't is this guy. This is Jeff Zeldman. And I have been following Jeffrey Zeldman's work on the open web and web standards for as long as I've been working in tech. He's somebody I enormously respect, and I agree with all of his positions and ideals about the way the web should be built on open standards and people should have control of their own data. And he's working, I didn't realize, I knew he was on the board of directors, I didn't realize he was actually a salaried employee, but yeah, he's at Automatic, and a couple of weeks ago, as all of his colleagues walked out of the door, he stayed. My insight into corporate legal disputes is as meaningful as my opinion on quantum mechanics. What I do know is that when given the chance this week to leave my job with half a year's salary, I chose to stay at Automatic. Now, the fact that Jeff Zeldman didn't walk, that's the one thing in all of this makes me think there's something going on that hasn't made it into the headlines yet. I'd be interested to see how this unfolds. That gets us. Nothing happens for an entire week. Then on October the 12th, WordPress.org, they take over one of the plugins. There's a plugin in that ecosystem that's maintained by WP Engine. WordPress go, yeah, no, we'll have that, which they're allowed to do because it's GPL code. There's no restriction stopping them doing that. So massively controversial, toxic move, but not actually illegal. Not actually disallowed. This creates this rift where the people running on WP Engine are now like, oh, what do you mean there's another distribute update channel we need to get engaged with here? 14th, so this is 2 days ago, WordCamp Sydney, which is a WordPress event in Australia, announced that they have been officially told they are not allowed to have any WP Engine speakers or sponsorship or presence at their event. Now, what they didn't say in here is what officially told means, because I don't know whether officially means the foundation, which is the nonprofit that governs the trademark, or whether Automatic just sent them a scary letter or something. This brings us up to where we are now, and we are here. And frankly, we are exhausted. Trying to keep up with what is going on with the state of WordPress licensing right now just feels like this. Now, I'm not going to comment on what Matt Mullenweg might have done, because for all I know, he's done some more insane bullshit while I've been giving this talk. Yeah, but there are two things in all of this that I think we can usefully take away and think about. First of all, if you want to make money out of open source software, become a lawyer. That would appear to be where all of the money is actually going in this little dispute right now, because both sides have engaged very, very expensive legal counsel. But the other one, I think WP Engine made a mistake. And I think they made a mistake that no one talks about because it's a mistake that all of us in this room make all the time, all day, every day, and it is so normalized, none of us even realize it might be a problem. How many of you folks out there have code running on .NET? That's all right, you can admit it. This is a friendly environment, because .NET's open source, right? And so you know, like deep in your heart, if something goes wrong with .NET, if you really had to, you could fix it. Like you could go in there and you could fix that bug yourself. Or if something happens tomorrow, you're like, well, it's all right, it's .NET, we'll take the code from yesterday. How many of you have a backup of .NET? Like the actual code, like all of it. Like if you went there tomorrow and you're like, oh, wow, GitHub's not there anymore, and NuGet's disappeared and Microsoft.com's vanished, could your company continue to operate? Would you still be able to? Of course you don't. That would be paranoid. But so much of the thinking about the value of free software and open source is informed by a day when getting software meant somebody gave you a copy of the source code that you would then compile to run on your own machine, and having physical possession of the source code was the thing that mattered the most. Because without the code, it doesn't matter how many rights you've got. You can't exactly go to court and go, hey, I've got this thing, says I can use .NET, and the judge is like, well, Microsoft vanished, so all right, join the queue, you know. And we don't think like that anymore. We don't think about building businesses, building revenue streams on top of open source. We think, oh, this is great, but we kind of assume that the fact they publish the code means they're also going to give us the plugins and the ecosystem and the management pipeline, and all that kind of thing will be around and maintained, and no one is ever going to restrict our access to it. Now, WordPress is an interesting case because it is GPL. Whatever else they do, they cannot turn around tomorrow and say the next edition of WordPress is closed source, because that's illegal. If they did it, they would have to sue themselves, which would make a lot of lawyers very rich. If you want to make money out of open source, be a lawyer. But the GPL is not the only license in town. Earlier this year, Redis did a very publicized and very controversial move where they said, look, we're kind of sick of companies like AWS running Redis just out of the box and charging loads of money and not giving any of it back. And Redis is published under the BSD license with a contributor license agreement, which means all the code that's been contributed, they know exactly who owns it. It's owned by Redis. And so they could turn around and go, yeah, the next version of Redis isn't going to be free. You can still get the code, but if you want to run it in the cloud, you have to buy a license. And of course, this upset a lot of people. The woodland animals were very unhappy. Microsoft turned around and went, you know what? Darn it, it's like Redis, but .NET and it's ours, and you don't have any of this stuff. A bunch of people forked Redis. They took the last version that was released under an open license, and they forked it into a new library called Valkey. And so 6 months on, if you want to run a high-performance key-value store in the cloud and you don't want to pay royalties on it, Valkey is the way to go, because Valkey is still free. Now, what I want to know is what's going to happen in a couple of years' time. What's going to happen further down the line? All these projects, Unity did this a couple of years ago. Terraform did the same thing. And in every case, what's happened is someone took something that used to be free, they said, we're going to close this down, and a group of developers, community advocates, whatever, they took the last free code base, they forked it, and went, come and use ours instead. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with Redis, I don't know what's going to happen with Valkey, but I do know what happens with Service Stack, because they did this 10 years ago. Service Stack was and is a framework for building applications on the .NET stack. I used it for loads of things way back in kind of 2014, 2015. It was excellent, really well-architectured library. I loved it, and this guy, Demis Bellot, he created it while he was working at Stack Overflow. And then he turned around and went, you know what, this can't be free anymore. I can't have it be free and have it be good, and I want it to be good, and so that means it can no longer be free. And they changed the license. Now, what happened is about a third of the users, they went, yeah, all right, and they just paid for it. About a third of them went, you know what, we don't really have a business case for this. We were just using it because it was free and it was nice. And that was me and my team. I went to my boss, I was like, so we started using this thing, and if we want the next version, it's going to be $8,000 per developer per year. And my boss said, what is it? And I said, it's a framework for building APIs. And my boss said, what are APIs? Do we sell those? And I said, not really. And he went, well, you can't have $8,000 a year. And so we switched to using, I think, NancyFX. But a small group of people, they took Service Stack and they forked it. And they created N-Service Kit. And they went, freedom, you know, we're going to put this out there and run it. Now, I emailed Demis earlier this year. I was like, I'm doing this talk all about open source, and I've been looking at what's happened with Redis. I want to know what happened with Service Stack. And he emailed me back, and he said, I've been working on it full-time ever since I left Stack Exchange. A decade of development later, the software itself has greatly improved. It's much more capable than was possible as a side project. I was willing to take a pay cut to work on it, so I was really surprised when I ended up making more money than any job I'd had prior. And he was like a senior engineer at Stack Exchange, so that gives you some idea the sort of money that's involved. Service Stack has allowed our family to be financially independent, giving me the freedom to work on whatever features I want. Financial independence, work on whatever features you want. Who's up for that? Sounds brilliant, right? Service Stack's gone from strength to strength. It's not free anymore. You can get the code, but if you're running it in a business that makes money, you have to buy licenses. They shipped version 8.2 earlier this year. They got plugins for Angular. They got plugins for RabbitMQ. They got all kinds of really good stuff. It is a solid, stable, well-maintained, and financially sustainable member of that ecosystem. And Service Kit, that had about a year of people going, it's brilliant, we'll put in all the features that we wanted. And then it just died. And last commit to their GitHub repository was 9 years ago, because when you fork the project that went commercial because they couldn't afford to run it, you've just volunteered to take on a project that's already proved it's not viable. Because the more people use it, the more bug reports you get, feature requests, the more support, maintenance. And if you don't have some way of translating that into resources you can use to manage that, sooner or later you're going to end up in the same situation they were in of going, we are overwhelmed with bug requests, so we don't have anybody around to fix them. And Wilbur's not a weasel. Actually, Wilbur might be a weasel. We don't know. But Wilbur is, earlier this year, there was a project called XZUtils. I mean, there's always been a project called XZUtils. It made headlines earlier this year. XZUtils is a compression utility that is built into the login and authentication software that runs most Linux distributions. Now, this is used by, I don't know, probably 60% of the servers on the planet. It's a big deal. This is the contributor history graph of the human beings who maintain this vital piece of internet security infrastructure. Lazoo has basically been running it by themselves since 2008. 2024, earlier this year, we suddenly get this little spike over here from somebody called Jiatan, GRT75. The same Sam made one submit to it in early 2024, and Adrian N. got in 2014, committed 11 things, and was never seen again. Now, the timelines here are interesting, because around the time that GRT75 shows up and starts contributing code, Lazoo is getting a lot of flack on forums for not being fast enough to merge pull requests, not being responsive. How dare you do this? You're being negligent. Huge amount of pressure. Now, this came incredibly close. You look at this timeline here. Just after that happens, boom, Jiatan shows up. Hey, friend, looks like you're having some trouble with your program there. Maybe I can help out with it. And came within, I think probably within about a week of the most sophisticated security backdoor that would ever have been deployed into the wild. There was some incredibly sophisticated engineering going on here. Things like intercepting build pipelines. So you had binaries that looked like you knew which source code they came from, but they didn't. They'd had stuff sneaked into them. This was discovered by mistake. There was a guy called Andreas Friend, who was an engineer working at Microsoft, who was working on optimization. And optimization means you want to shut down everything else so you can see how fast your code goes. And just noticed that there was a login daemon that was using more cycles than it should have done, and so did a little bit of sniffing, was like, this is really weird and bad. And we discovered it by fluke, by luck. We came this close to this thing making it into the pipeline that would have gone into things like Red Hat Enterprise Linux and put a backdoor. Now, no one knows who GRT75 is. It is still, we don't know if it was a person, we don't know if it was a group of people, we don't know if it was nation-state operators, but it was a very sophisticated attack that came frighteningly close to succeeding. And the attack was technically sophisticated, but the mechanism which allowed it, the first foothold on that kind of ladder of engineering there, was social engineering. It was putting pressure on this one overworked maintainer to the point where they were maybe a little more cavalier about accepting pull requests and merges from a total stranger than we'd like to think. Now, everyone in this industry, everyone in this room, if money was no object and you had all the time in the world, I'm sure you'd all build the most amazing software. It would be beautiful, and it would be fast, and it would be secure, and you'd have time to fix all of the things. That's not the world we live in. This is capitalism. Time is money, and the pressure is always on. And we are seeing a phenomenon at the moment where a lot of folks, they've put something out there in the world which is free. And they built it, they gave it away, and then suddenly they're like, maybe I shouldn't have given that away for free, because the economy has shifted a little bit, and times are hard, and people are hurting, and actually, maybe can I not make the next version free? Is there any way I could charge for this? Now, if there's one thing you take away from this talk, I want you to remember this quote. People who share their source code don't owe you anything. If I give you my code, you have my code, and if I put a license on it, it means you have my code, you have my permission to run it. You can keep it, you can run it, you can build a business on it, you can do whatever you want. You can't come back tomorrow and ask me to fix it. You can't come back tomorrow and expect it to still be there. You can't come back to me 6 months later and complain that it didn't do something you want. It does not entitle you to anything. People who share their source code, all they give you is the code and the right to run it. And what you do with it after that point, that is entirely on you. If a problem in that code is going to disrupt your business, you can't come back to the people who published it as open source and blame them for it. There's no warranties. This program is supplied without warranty for any particular purpose. That is on you and your company and your team and your project. And what's amazing is that there are so many people for whom this isn't good enough. I use Adobe Creative Cloud. I pay them $50 a month to be able to run Photoshop and After Effects and all the things I use to do photography and videos. And if they turn around tomorrow and go, you know what, $500, I can pay them $500 or I can lose access to a decade of my own work. And if they turn around tomorrow and go, oops, deleted the authentication service, sorry, our bad, I can't log in, I can't do anything. I mean, I could try and find a crack on the Pirate Bay or something, but if I find a bug in Photoshop, I can't fix it. I can report it, and a week later they'll go, have you tried turning it off and on again? You're like, yes, I have actually tried that. Now, these are fantastic tools. I love what they do. They're not perfect, but I am acutely aware that so much of the work I do is tied into a closed source ecosystem that I'm only allowed to participate in because I keep paying people money for it. And there are people out there going, well, it's your mistake. You shouldn't be using Adobe Creative Cloud, man. It's closed source software. It's evil. You should be using open source. And I say, well, what should I use instead of Adobe After Effects? And they say, I should use Blender and the GIMP. Blender and the GIMP is a cop show that never got made from the 1970s. Actually, no. Blender and the GIMP are fine tools. They do not replace the things in Adobe Creative Cloud. Not even close. Blender is awesome. The GIMP is pretty good. Adobe After Effects is unique. There's nothing even close to it. Now, I love that the Free Software Foundation exists. I love that there is this free enterprise-grade operating system out there, but clearly something doesn't add up, because at one extreme, we've got free as in speech, free as in beer. At the other extreme, we've got $50 a month or you lose access to your own work. And a lot of people in the middle going, I don't want to do that, but I don't want to do that. Is there maybe a better way we can work with this? Now, Spotify has revolutionized the way that people listen to music. If you ever want to know why people in my generation are bitter and cynical, we had to buy LPs, and then we had to replace our LPs with CDs, and then we had to replace our CDs with the iTunes store, and then someone turned around and actually, no, you're now going to pay a subscription to listen to music you already paid for 3 times. But Spotify is convenience. I pay Spotify $15 a month, and I don't own any of that music, but if I want to hear the new Taylor Swift album, click, bang, there it is. Oh yeah, that's quite good. The cloud is Spotify for business infrastructure. If your company wants a 64-core PostgreSQL server right now, you don't want to get out of a box. You want to click a button, put in MasterCard, and boom, there it is. And when you've finished using it, you can't sell it. You don't own it. You were renting it. You just get to give the thing back. And if you have ever tried to get your company to pay for open source, you'll know that GitHub has a sponsorship program. The mechanisms are all there. You go to your boss and like, hey, I think we should pay money for this. Boss says, why? You're like, because it's the right thing to do. And they're like, well, do we have the code? Yeah. Well, then don't pay them. We've already got what we need. This is capitalism. Getting money out of companies is difficult. Even getting within sniffing distance of their wallets is impossible, unless you can become a line item on their cloud bill, because no one looks at that. Who hosts on Google Cloud or Azure or AWS or any of those? Who has like bills every month that are thousands, maybe tens of thousands of euros? Who would notice another 50? Another 100, another 500. If we could figure out a way of getting revenue out of the massive companies just by paying for it on their cloud bill and percolating that back out into the ecosystem, we might be onto something. Now, this is not a business model, this is a thought experiment, but I did some numbers, and I kind of crunched a couple of things based on the NuGet ecosystem. And what I did is I looked at the package download statistics, I extrapolated how many active users I think NuGet probably has. If you want to see the numbers for this, I'll link to the website at the end, which has all the calculations. But I basically came out with NuGet has 53 billion downloads every 6 weeks. Tell that next time someone on Hacker News says that .NET is dead. That's 40 billion downloads a month adjusted for, let's keep a little bit in our own pocket so we got money to run the thing. About 2.4 million active users. Now let's say we launched NuGet Premium. And we said, all right, NuGet, there's a free tier, hobbyists, students, companies that don't make any money, early stage startups. Then there's the basic plan, it's $15 a month. We got the indie plan, $75, and then enterprise is $500 a month. Very little sliver there. This would bring in $43 million in revenue every month. If we divide that by the number of downloads, it works out at roughly $0.001 per NuGet download. Now, this is an insultingly tiny amount of money. Even Spotify pays more than this, and Spotify is famously awful at paying artists for their work. And open source is so bad that going halfway from here to Spotify would be a massive step in the right direction, because this would mean that libraries like Automapper and Mock, they would be bringing in about $13,000 a month, which is enough money to hire maintainers, enough money to pay for infrastructure, enough money that you got people to respond to bugs and jump on security vulnerabilities. Image Sharp, we got any folks in here using that? Awesome library, a little bit niche perhaps. This would bring in about $3,000 a month. Now that's not quit your job money, but that's like, boss, I need to take Fridays off for the next couple of months to work on a new release. That kind of justifies some of the time put into it. And something like N-Audio, which is Mark Heath's audio processing library. Mark gets a new laptop every 3 years, which is not amazing, but it's also not nothing. And that, to me, feels like the numbers are in the right kind of ballpark. Now, yeah, we're almost done. I'm aware that the clock is ticking and that the beers are next. But this is capitalism. The winning move when you see something free is not to support it, it is to exploit it until it is gone, because line must go up, and boss always want to make line go up. And what you got to remember with all of this is that we are not selling software. We are taking the model from the 1990s of taking code that is free and providing distribution as a paid convenience. We're going to take these libraries, we compile them, we make that available to you. Now, could we do this with NuGet or Maven or NPM or the Python Ruby gems, any of those? No, of course we couldn't, because the Woodland folk would riot, because it's free today, which means it can't be paid tomorrow. But something interesting is going to happen over the next couple of years to the way I think software is going to get built and packaged and distributed. And that is the WebAssembly system interface. Because WASI is basically, we've had 25 years of the web, we figured out what it can do well, and it turns out that JavaScript is not one of those things, but that running programs in browsers is quite good. And so there is a systems interoperation interface. What this means in a nutshell is a couple of years from now, there could be one library for doing JPEGs. And it doesn't matter if your team's working in Rust or C# or Go or Python or whatever, that is the JPEG library. And maybe it's written in Haskell. I don't know. I don't care. That's the JPEG library, and that's what the entire development ecosystem uses to do JPEGs. And maybe there's another one for doing, mathematical calculations. There's one for machine learning. These will all be interoperable, because that's what WASI does, is it gives us interfaces between packages deployed and built in different ecosystems, which means we're going to end up with WASI packages. We're going to end up with something that does for this new paradigm what NuGet does for .NET, what Maven does for Java, what NPM does for Node.js. And so maybe before we all rush headlong into giving out WASI packages for free to show everyone how clever we are, and then 2 years later we realize we're not clever, we're tired and exhausted and have no money, maybe let's stop and think if we could approach this slightly differently. We've done free as in beer. Free as in beer worked brilliantly. There are people all over the world doing amazing stuff with software that they didn't have to pay for. We have free tools, free libraries, free operating systems, and we have some questions about sustainability and whether people are getting the rewards they should be getting and the recognition they should be getting for the code they put out there. We've seen free as in speech. It's amazing. There is an enterprise-grade operating system that is owned by nobody and everybody, and they can't shut it down, and they can't take it away. But as we've seen with things like XZ-utils, free as in speech does not stop abuse. It doesn't stop pressure. It doesn't stop social engineering, and it doesn't provide a sustainable mechanism. Just giving stuff away for free is not the be-all and end-all solution that the hippies in California thought it was going to be. But there's another kind of free. And it's the kind of free where you wake up on a Saturday morning, you're like, you know what? I got a free day. Like, I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to work. I'm not terribly worried about money. I'm not worried about my boss paging me and saying we've got a security vulnerability and I need to log on right now and come into the office. It is the freedom to get off the grid. It's the freedom to go, you know what? I'm not going to worry about software for a couple of days. The mechanisms that are there are going to work. It's all sustainable. It's all good. I'm not going to come back to chaos here. We've had free as in beer. We've had free as in speech. Let's do free as in weekend. Thank you.